Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Today we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah,
It's a lot of executive orders and
Mhm.
policy changes that have got people a little on edge about the future of the U.S.
For sure.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at presidential pardons, uh, the crackdown on immigration, and the rollback of LGBTQ plus rights, and all this is based on the sources that you've shared with us.
Right.
These are all very sensitive topics, so things might get a little intense.
Yeah,
But just remember that we're here to unpack the facts from the sources, and we're not taking sides.
absolutely.
So are we seeing a dangerous shift towards authoritarianism, or is this just like a course correction by a new administration?
Well, it is a turbulent time, and
Mhm.
it's really important to understand the context and impact of these developments, I think.
Yeah.
So let's start with the pardons.
Okay.
We're talking about roughly 1,500 individuals who
Mhm.
have been pardoned. They were all convicted in connection with the January 6th Capitol riot. Right.
And about 240 of those were actually in prison,
Oh, wow.
and they've been released immediately.
240 people released right away.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
It is.
And I understand that some of those who have been released are actually leaders of groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers.
That's right.
And I know those names have been in the news a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on who they are and why their release is causing such concern.
Sure. So the Proud Boys,
Yeah.
I mean, they're more than just your average far-right group.
Right.
They have this ideology that they call Western chauvinism, but many experts classify them as straight-up neo-fascist.
Oh, wow.
And, their actions definitely back that up.
Like what kind of actions?
Well, think back to that rally in Charlottesville in 2017.
Yeah.
They were right in the thick of it.
Oh, right.
They've been linked to violence and hate speech time and time again.
Yeah. That's scary.
Yeah. And both Canada and New Zealand have actually designated them as terrorist organizations. That's pretty alarming, especially knowing that these people are now free.
Yeah.
What about the Oath Keepers?
So the Oath Keepers are a little bit different.
Okay.
They're an anti-government militia group, heavily armed and very, very distrustful of authority.
Yeah.
They believe that they are upholding the Constitution,
Right.
but their methods are,
Questionable.
yeah, let's just say outside the mainstream.
Right.
They've been involved in armed standoffs with federal agents.
Oh, yeah?
Remember the Bundy Ranch standoff back in 2014?
I do, vaguely, yeah.
That was the Oath Keepers.
Okay.
So you can see why people are concerned about these groups being emboldened by these pardons.
Right, like especially their leaders.
Right. Could it lead to more recruitment
Yeah.
or even incite further political violence?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It's definitely something to think about.
Some argue that these pardons are a necessary step towards national healing.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a tough question. And I think it really gets to the heart of what we're trying to understand here.
Yeah.
You see, on the one hand, pardons are a traditional presidential power.
Right.
They can be seen as acts of mercy
Mm-hmm.
or a way to try to bridge deep divides.
Yeah.
But when you look at these specific pardons,
Right.
they raise some really serious questions about accountability.
Yeah, for sure.
Do they send a dangerous message
Like, what do you mean?
that extremism and violence against the government will be tolerated?
Yeah.
So it's a delicate balance
Yeah.
between upholding the rule of law and promoting unity.
Right.
And where that line is drawn is definitely up for debate.
It's definitely a lot to think about, especially when you think about it in the context of their past actions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, let's move on now and talk about another major policy shift,
Sure.
the immigration crackdown.
Yeah.
From what I'm seeing in these sources, it seems like the new administration isn't just talking about stricter policies. They're really taking some pretty aggressive moves.
Absolutely.
What are you seeing?
Well, it's a multi-pronged approach, really.
Oh.
They're aiming to restrict immigration and overhaul the asylum system at the same time.
At the same time. Wow.
Yeah, we're seeing concrete actions like suspending entry for certain individuals,
Mm-hmm.
barring access to asylum for others,
Oh, wow.
and even carrying out summary deportations.
Wow.
And on top of all that, there's been a huge surge in IC operations across the country.
Okay, that's a lot to digest.
Yeah.
Can you break down some of those actions a little bit?
Sure.
I'm particularly interested in this Section 212 of the Immigration and Nationality Act.
Okay.
I know it's being used to justify suspending entry for people who are deemed part of an invasion at the southern border.
Right?
Why is that so controversial?
Well, Section 212 is incredibly broad.
Okay.
It basically gives the president the power to block entire groups of people from entering the country based on almost any reason.
Really?
Yeah, if they deem it a threat to national interests.
Wow.
It's been used in the past. But this application is especially controversial because of that invasion language.
Right.
Critics argue that it fuels this really dangerous narrative that just doesn't reflect the reality of the situation at the border.
Right.
And that it could be used to justify discriminatory policies.
It sounds like that term is being used deliberately to stoke fear and anxiety.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
And it's not just about keeping people out, is it?
No.
These sources are highlighting a real escalation in ICE operations within the U.S. What kind of impact are those having on communities?
Well, you're right. There has been a significant increase in ICE activity.
Yeah.
We're seeing reports of hundreds of arrests and detainers.
Wow.
In Chicago, for instance, Operation Safeguard targeted around 2,000 people for immigration enforcement.
1,000 people.
Yeah, and the way these operations are being conducted is raising some serious concerns.
Can you elaborate on those concerns?
Yeah.
The sources mention potential legal and human rights violations.
Right.
Even violations of the Fourth Amendment.
Yeah.
What exactly is happening on the ground?
So we're seeing reports of people being detained without warrants.
Oh, wow.
Individuals being deported while their legal proceedings are still pending,
Oh.
and even allegations of racial profiling during these operations.
That's awful.
Yeah, it's a situation that has a lot of legal experts worried about due process violations.
Right.
And unreasonable searches and seizures.
It sounds chaotic and frightening, especially for those in immigrant communities.
Absolutely.
I imagine it's causing a lot of fear and distrust.
Oh, yeah. There's a tangible sense of fear in a lot of immigrant communities.
Yeah.
People are afraid to leave their homes,
Right.
to go to work,
Yeah.
or even to seek medical attention.
Oh, gosh.
Because they're afraid of being caught in an ICE raid.
Wow.
This climate of fear really erodes trust in law enforcement.
Yeah.
And that can have some really long-lasting consequences for community safety.
I can only imagine.
Yeah.
I'm curious what sort of pushback is happening in response to all this. Are states and cities just standing by and letting this happen?
Not at all. There's been some pretty significant pushback from states and cities across the country.
Oh, okay, good.
Many have implemented what are known as sanctuary policies to protect their immigrant residents.
Oh, yeah, sanctuary cities.
Exactly.
Can you explain how those work?
Sure.
Like, what kind of protections do they actually offer?
So essentially, sanctuary policies limit cooperation between local law enforcement
Okay.
and federal immigration authorities.
Okay.
For example, police in sanctuary cities generally won't ask about someone's immigration status during routine interactions.
Okay.
And they won't hold people for ICE just based on an immigration detainer.
So they're creating a safe space where people can interact with local authorities
Right.
without fear of being turned over to IC.
Exactly.
And are we seeing these policies in action?
Yeah, we're seeing real examples of this resistance playing out across the country.
Like what?
Well, Oregon and Illinois, they've passed laws that restrict the transfer of individuals to ICE custody.
Okay.
California has some of the strongest sanctuary laws in the nation.
Right.
And cities like Philadelphia have actually blocked ICE from accessing certain records databases.
It sounds like a real battle brewing between the federal government and those trying to protect immigrant communities.
It is.
Where do you think this is headed?
That's hard to say.
Yeah.
But what is clear is that this is a really, really divisive issue,
Right.
and it's likely to be a major point of contention for years to come.
Yeah.
The future of immigration in America is at stake,
Right.
and how we navigate this is going to have lasting consequences for millions of lives
Right.
and for the very soul of this nation.
That's a lot to think about.
It is.
And unfortunately, we have to keep moving because there's another important area to explore.
Right. LGBTQ plus rights under fire.
Yeah, this is where things might get really intense.
Yeah, get ready. We're seeing a real shift in policy concerning LGBTQ plus rights, with a series of executive orders aimed at rolling back protections.
Yeah, it's definitely a stark contrast to the previous administration's stance on LGBTQ plus rights.
Right.
Can you give us some specifics about what these executive orders actually change
Sure.
and how they're impacting people's lives?
Yeah. So one of the most sweeping changes is this mandate to recognize only two genders,
Uh,
male and female, in federal documents and policies.
Wow.
And this has a huge impact on transgender and non-binary individuals
Right.
who don't identify with either of those
So
categories.
that's like their identity is being erased
Yeah,
for
essentially.
the official records.
Right. And it affects access to healthcare, employment, education, even basic legal protections.
Yeah.
It's a significant step backward in terms of recognizing and respecting gender diversity.
It's really concerning. It's like they're being told they don't exist.
Hmm.
I'm also seeing in these sources about the elimination of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs
Right.
across federal agencies.
Yeah.
What's the reasoning behind that?
So the administration argues that these programs are divisive
Okay.
and that they promote a woke agenda
Okay.
that's out of touch with mainstream America.
Right.
They say they want to promote unity and focus on like shared American values, but critics see it as an attempt to silence marginalized voices
Yeah.
and to roll back progress toward a more inclusive society.
It seems like there are two very different perspectives on what it means to create a more unified country.
Yeah, for sure.
What about all the executive orders from the previous administration
Right.
that promoted LGBTQ plus equality?
Yeah, those have been reversed too.
Okay, so how many of those were there?
About 78 of those orders have been rescinded.
78.
And those covered a whole range of issues from employment discrimination and healthcare access to protections for transgender students.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive rollback
Yeah.
of policies that were designed to protect LGBTQ plus individuals from discrimination
Right.
and to make sure that they had equal opportunities.
It sounds like a significant loss for the LGBTQ plus community.
It is.
But what does this mean practically for people on the ground? Like, what's the real world impact of these policy changes?
So one area of major concern is healthcare.
Okay.
The new policies prohibit federal funding for what they call gender ideology
Okay.
and gender-affirming healthcare.
And what does that mean?
So that means transgender individuals could face some major obstacles in accessing hormone therapy surgery or even mental health services
Wow.
related to their gender identity.
So they're being denied essential health care.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's terrible.
Yeah, and it's especially alarming for young people
Right.
who rely on these services for their well-being.
Right.
Imagine being a teenager struggling with your gender identity
Yeah.
and suddenly being denied access to the healthcare you need.
That's heartbreaking, and I can only imagine how isolating and scary that would be for those young people.
Yeah.
The sources also mention a push to enhance privacy in intimate settings, which sounds pretty benign on the surface, but I have a feeling there's more to it than that.
Yeah, you're right. That phrase can be pretty misleading.
Okay, so what does that mean in practice?
Well, it's often used as a cover for policies
Okay.
that target transgender people's access to bathrooms, locker rooms,
Right?
and other facilities that align with their gender identity.
Okay.
It's basically forcing them to use facilities that don't correspond with how they see themselves,
Wow.
which can be incredibly dehumanizing and unsafe for transgender individuals.
So it's not really about privacy.
No.
It's about controlling where transgender people can and can't go.
Exactly.
And what about education?
Yeah.
There's been a lot of debate about protections for transgender students in schools.
Right.
What's changing there?
So the administration has pledged to eliminate those protections,
Oh, wow.
arguing that they infringe on the rights of other students,
Okay.
and that decisions about bathroom use and sports participation should be left up to states and local school districts.
So what does that mean for transgender students?
Well, it could mean that they'll no longer be able to use bathrooms or locker rooms
Right.
that match their gender identity.
And they might face discrimination in school sports.
Exactly.
It sounds like a recipe for increased bullying and harassment.
Yeah, it's a big concern.
Aren't transgender students already vulnerable to this kind of treatment?
Unfortunately, yes, transgender students already face disproportionately high rates of bullying and harassment in schools.
Right.
And taking away these protections could make the situation even worse,
Yeah.
creating a really hostile and unwelcoming environment for some of the most vulnerable students.
It's also disheartening.
Yeah.
It feels like we're taking a giant leap backwards.
Mm-hmm.
Back to a time when people were discriminated against simply for being who they are.
Yeah, I understand that feeling.
Are there any signs of hope here?
Yeah,
Is anyone pushing back against these policy changes?
absolutely. Organizations like Lambda Legal are already preparing legal challenges,
Okay.
arguing that these policies violate federal civil rights laws and are unconstitutional.
Yeah.
They're mobilizing resources, building coalitions, and getting ready to fight these policies in court.
Wow.
Yeah, they believe these policies are discriminatory and harmful,
Yeah.
and that they won't stand up to legal scrutiny.
I really hope they're successful.
Me too.
It's so crucial to have organizations like Lambda Legal fighting for the rights of marginalized communities.
It is.
But it raises a bigger question. Are these policies a reflection of changing social values, or are they a sign that we're becoming a less tolerant and inclusive society?
That's a really complex question, and I think it's at the heart of this whole discussion.
Yeah.
These policies and the pushback against them
Right.
really reflect a fundamental debate about American values
Yeah.
and who we are as a nation. Are we a country that embraces diversity and inclusion,
Yeah.
or are we retreating into fear and division?
Right.
And the answer isn't simple, and it's a debate that's likely to continue for a long time.
It's a lot to process, for sure.
Yeah.
We've covered some really heavy topics today.
We have.
Pardons that raise questions about justice,
Mm-hmm.
immigration policies that are sparking resistance, and LGBTQ+ rights facing a significant rollback.
Yeah.
It's hard to know what to make of it all.
It is. It's important to remember, though, that these aren't just abstract political issues.
Right.
They have real-world consequences for real people.
Yeah.
These policy changes are impacting lives, families, communities across the country.
Yeah.
It's so important to stay informed,
Mm.
engaged,
Yeah.
and to keep these human stories at the forefront of our minds.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to end on.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can feel really overwhelming, to be honest,
Right.
when you think about the scale of these changes and the impact they're having on so many people.
Yeah.
What can we as individuals even do
Right.
in the face of such sweeping policy shifts?
It's easy to feel powerless in times like these,
Yeah.
but I think it's so important to remember that these issues are complex,
Right.
and there are valid arguments on multiple sides,
Yeah.
but that complexity shouldn't paralyze us.
Right.
It should energize us to stay informed,
Yeah.
to engage in these discussions, and most importantly, to advocate for the values that we believe in.
I appreciate you saying that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good reminder that we all have a voice
Mm-hmm.
and that we can use it to make a difference.
Exactly.
It's easy to get caught up in the negativity,
Right.
but we can't let that stop us from taking action.
Exactly. History is not a spectator sport.
Right.
We all have a role to play in shaping the future, even if it feels small at times.
Yeah, that's true.
And change is a constant.
Yeah.
Even in the darkest of times, there's always the possibility for things to shift in a more positive direction.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
So, in a time of rapid change and deep division,
Mm-hmm.
what role can each of us play
Right.
in creating a more just and equitable future?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't
Yeah.
it? And honestly, there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
But I think it starts with being informed, staying engaged with these issues,
Yeah.
and engaging in respectful dialogue, even when we disagree.
Right.
We need to be willing to listen to different perspectives,
Yeah.
even when they challenge our own beliefs.
Yeah. That's a hard one.
It is,
Yeah.
but important.
Yeah, and we have to hold our leaders accountable for their actions,
Right?
making sure that our voices are heard.
Right. And it also means supporting organizations like Lambda Legal
Absolutely.
that are fighting for the rights and well-being of those who are most vulnerable.
Or on the front lines of these battles.
Right.
And they need our support.
They do.
And don't underestimate the power of individual acts of kindness and compassion.
That's true.
Even small gestures can make a difference in someone's life.
Right.
A kind word, a listening ear, a helping hand.
Mm-hmm.
These things matter,
Yeah.
especially in times of fear and uncertainty.
You know, as heavy as this deep dive has been,
Yeah.
I'm actually feeling a little bit hopeful now.
It's a good reminder that we're not powerless in the face of these challenges. There's always something we can do,
Yeah,
even if it feels small.
exactly.
I like that.
Remember, change starts with each of us.
Yeah.
It starts with how we treat each other, how we engage with our communities, and how we use our voices to advocate for a better world.
Well said. Well, on that note, we're going to leave you with a thought to ponder.
Oh,
As you go about your day, we've seen how executive actions are impacting the lives of everyday Americans.
right.
From those who were incarcerated for their actions on January 6th, to those seeking asylum at the border, to transgender youth navigating their identity.
Yeah.
So we ask you, in this era of uncertainty and upheaval.
Right.
What steps will you take to make the world a little bit better?
That's a great question.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.